Hey guys, what's up? So this will be episode 5 in this series, which is Beginner Blacksmith Hand Forged Knife. If you are just tuning in and this is your first video, then make sure you go back and watch the first 4 parts to find out how we got to this point. If you've been watching along, then you know this is where we left off at the end of the last episode. We got our bevel profile, our bevel ground in, got our handles rough cut, drilled the scales, and then loosely fit everything. So what we're going to do on this episode is we're going to glue up the handles, and then we are going to rough sand grind the handles, and then do the finishing sanding on the handles. So this episode is going to go over all of that. So basically this is going to talk about that. What you're going to need, or what I use, G-Flex, which is a 2-part epoxy. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. You could use 5-minute epoxy, any of those epoxies that are 2-part. 5-minute epoxy would, it'll work. It may or may not be the strongest bond ever. I haven't really heard of anybody's scales failing using 5-minute epoxy. But this one is used by many people in the industry that make knives. It's proven. There's other epoxies that are out. I know Combat Abrasives just came out with a new epoxy system a few months ago, and I know there's a few other brands as well. This one is not bad. I bought this set, which came in this box, on Amazon, and I want to say it was 25 bucks or somewhere in that range, and I've used this to make nearly 40 knives, and it's still just under halfway. So if you're wondering why I wrote dates on there, that's when I purchased it. They say that this has a shelf life of about 6 months, so which I'm past 6 months now, obviously, but it's still working good. I've kept it, pretty much in a cool, dry place that's never been sitting out in the sun. It always goes back in the box when I'm done with it and back on the shelf. But basically, what you're going to want to do is you want to get yourself an epoxy, whatever type, 2-part, whatever brand you want. You want a mixing cup. You could use anything. Some guys do it right on their, they put a couple pieces of blue tape down, and they do that way. It's up to you how you want to mix it. You just want to make sure you're able to mix it and mix it well. You're going to want some rubbing alcohol or acetone, and then you'll use that to do a real quick clean on your scales and on your blade before you do the glue up. You're going to want some gloves to wear because you don't want to get epoxy all over, and you're going to want some clamps. You could use all kinds of clamps. There's the quick ones, there's the plastic ones, there's little C-clamps. I mean, there's numerous types of clamps. I like going with these C-clamps. They're cheap. You can get them at Harbor Freight. They're like $2 each, something like that. If they get too much epoxy on them, then you could, just throw them away if you had to. I mean, usually you can just break off whatever dried epoxy is on them and then just keep using them. But they're cheap enough that they're easily replaceable. So you got those, and you'll also want to have some Q-tips, which I have right back here. And that's going to be for after. Once you put your glue on and you have your handles clamped on, I use Q-tips with alcohol, and I always clean this line here. So you want to try not to get any epoxy coming out of your scales onto the blade, because you're not really going to be able to sand that off. So you want to try and keep it as clean as possible. So that's it. That's what we need, and let's get started on gluing these handles up. Alright guys, So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get a little bit of alcohol and just wipe down the tang of my knife and the inside of the scales, just to make sure there's no oils or residue or anything on there that might prevent the epoxy from doing a really good bond. Other things that you may want to do, which I ran this real quick over the sander. So this is the inside of the scales. Sometimes you want to rough them up. If you buy pre-made scales, typically they come fairly smooth. If not, you'll want to put some sandpaper on a granite surface plate like this, and you can sand it flat. Or if you have a disc sander, or even on the flat platen on your grinder, you can also do that. You want to make sure that it's fairly flat. It doesn't have to be perfect because the epoxy will fill in any little gaps that are in there. So it doesn't have to be like perfect flat. So everything's wiped up. When you mix your epoxy, you don't really need a lot, especially for just one knife. So I did maybe just barely enough to fill the bottom of this cup. And you want to do equal parts if you're using a 2-part epoxy. If you're using the 5-minute epoxy, they're usually in some kind of an applicator where as you push them out, it gives you equal parts. Take your popsicle stick or whatever you're using for mixing. I mean, these type of consumables are so cheap, to get a pack of popsicle sticks and a little 2-ounce plastic cups. They're really inexpensive. And it's also nice because you always want to keep whatever's left of your epoxy. So when you let this sit overnight, you can always tell if it's good, if the epoxy that's in the cup or that's on your piece of tape is solid as well. So the way that I usually start, you want to make sure that you have the correct side that you're starting with. So this is actually this side. I want to start with this side. Make sure that you're on the inside, and then a lot of times too, if you're doing multiple knives or projects, you can even write inside left, inside right on your scale so that you don't mix them up, because if you glue them the wrong way, then you're going to have a hard time probably putting them on first off, because the pinholes may not line up, and second, you're going to have to redo how your handle looks most likely. So you want to put a good amount on here. I try to stay a little back from that forward edge because it'll get squeezed out to limit the amount that actually comes out. So I got that coated fairly well. I'm going to take my pins, put just a little bit on them, and put them into there. And then I'm going to drop my knife on there. And this is where making your holes slightly larger than what your pin diameter is really helps out, because if your holes are exactly a 1/4 inch and your pins are exactly a 1/4 inch, you're going to have a hard time getting all this together. It's really easy to crack a handle scale, especially if you're using wood. If they don't fit, that's why you want to try and do a dry run fit before. Make sure that everything fits okay, because you don't want to get in the middle of doing a glue up and then realize that your scales or your pins don't fit properly. Again, on that one, I'm staying a little bit back from the edge. That should be more than enough there. I'm going to take some of this excess epoxy and fill these holes. You want to try and fill those up there. And we'll go ahead and slide this on. There should be more than enough epoxy around the pins. Alright. And even though you're wearing gloves, I try to keep them clean because you don't want to be touching your blade and anything else getting epoxy everywhere. So I try to keep one hand clean, one hand gluey, I guess. Most epoxies you have time, to work with it, so you don't have to be in a rush. 5-minute epoxy, obviously, you're going to need to go a little bit faster. So typically when I'm putting the scales on my knife, doing the glue up, You want to push this pin to make sure it's sticking out a good enough space on both sides. I typically use 3 of these clamps on an average sized knife. If it's a smaller or larger knife, you know, use your best judgment. And also, whenever I'm gluing up my knives, I always like to stand them up because I don't want any glue running, which the glue will. You don't want to put your knife like this or like this because the glue is going to run out. So I got that first one on there. And usually I open these up before I start. I just forgot to this time. So this one's going to go this way. I like to alternate my clamps as far as the side to side so that you're not really hitting your handles when you're trying to tighten them down. And also you want to try to distribute the weight so that your knife will stand up okay. And then the last one I usually use kind of as a brace on the ground or on your tabletop. So you see how there's epoxy dripping out. The epoxy will run, so you need to make sure that you have your knife sitting in a position that any epoxy running is not going to cause you more work down the road. So I want to get it to where it'll stand up in this position. While your epoxy is still wet, you want to make sure that your pins are centered. So I put the clamp over the pin on this side, so I want to readjust that. Push this pin through and then retighten. And then reposition it so that it's going to hold the knife blade in an upright position. Make sure everything's nice and tight. I like putting wax paper down just to keep my bench cleaner. So I got pretty much the handle all glued up. At this point, I like to take my Q-tips with alcohol, and I didn't really get much at all, any bleed out, but I'm still going to run a line across there and push down any epoxy at all that may have can't come out. You want to try and keep this edge clean, keep your blade clean. And then we'll turn it to this other side. And don't go back and forth with your Q-tips. Do one swipe and then one swipe with the other end. Because if you did get epoxy on there and you go back and you do a second swipe, you're just rubbing epoxy on your blade. So that's it for this step. We're going to basically let this sit overnight so that it totally cures, and then we will come back and pick it up from there. I'll do some more close-up shots with the camera so you guys can see everything. Alright, so here's some close-up or closer views. But you can see everything's on there nice and tight all the way around. You have even distribution on your clamps. And everything's good. The knife stands upright. It's in a good position. So there we go. So we'll let this sit overnight and then we'll come back and we'll go on to the next step. Alright guys, what's up? It's the next day. Actually it's been a few days since I made it back to my shop. But the knife is right here where we left it. Handles are all glued up, everything's dry. You always, keep your test cup. Make sure that the epoxy is totally hardened. I've never had it not hardened though. But this G-Flex epoxy is really good epoxy. So, and then we remove the clamps, and sometimes they get a little stuck on there. You just got to pop them off. If you try to keep as little epoxy from hitting the outsides of the scales as you can, then the clamps won't really go. But sometimes when you're next to a pin, you can't really help it. I've seen some makers, they'll actually wrap the scales in wax paper and then put the clamps on. Another way to keep the clamps from sticking, but it's not too bad usually. Alright, so that's our knife. That's where it's at right now. So what we're going to do in this episode, which I'm pretty sure this will be the last episode, Basically going to clean all this up, going to cut these pins down to size, rough in the handle on the belt grinder, and then it'll be hand sanding from there. And then the very last thing that we'll do is I'll put an edge on the blade. So that's where we're at. Let's get going. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to trim off these pins, any excess glue, and then maybe just a little bit of the wood, like if we can get a good corner off. Most of that I'll do on the 2x72. But here we go, it's going to be loud. Alright, so we got the pins cut down, cut a little bit off the corners, the rest we'll switch to the 2x72 and pick up there. So when you're grinding on your 2x72, you can start, this is where you'll do the rough shaping on your knife. So there's several different attachments you can use on your 2x72. I usually do the flat to clean up the flats. I'll switch to the my 12-inch wheel to do the majority of the rest of it, the back, the top I should say by the spine, the back here, and then also a little bit of the underside. And then I'll switch to a small wheel attachment, and then I can get inside here in the choil area and then some of the more concurve areas of the handle. From there, I usually use the small wheel attachment to start to shave in the sides and do the rough shaping of the handle. And then from there, we go to the hand sanding. Alright, here we go. Alright, let's head outside. Alright guys, so this is where we're at. This is after running it on the belt grinder, the 2x72. Basically just roughing it in. And this is something that you'll kind of get the hang of as you do it, and you'll develop a style, I guess, that you like. This handle is really simple in this one. I didn't want to do anything crazy. Probably going to sell this knife for pretty cheap. So, but that's it. Is that focused? There we go. So you can see, did a little contouring here on the finger hole, a little bit on the handle side. The back is just rounded pretty much, tapered towards the front. The butt is rounded off. So as you work and get better on your handle making, you'll notice that you'll get better symmetry on your handles. This one's not great. I mean, I still have a lot to learn on my handles, but some guys you'll see, they get very, very symmetrical and precise with their handles, and they turn out really beautiful. It's just how much time you want to spend on it and how much you expect to sell the knife for. So I'm not going to sell this knife for a lot, so I'm not going to spend a really long time refining it. But that's where we're at. Now we're going to be off to hand sanding. Alright, so when you're getting ready to do hand sanding, there's a couple of ways that you can do it. This here is a knife vise, and it's made by Malone Knives. He sells these on his website. And basically the way that this thing works is you load your knife in, you tighten this down, and that basically locks your knife in place, right? And then these other knobs you can do to either turn left and right if you need to, or rotate your knife. So if you're working on one side, rather than taking the knife out, flipping it, whatever, you just rotate it. So that's one method you can use to do it. I actually prefer on my hybrid scales to wet sand. So any of the scales that I have that are half epoxy, half wood, like this one is, I actually prefer to wet sand these, which I could do in this vise, but I don't really want to get the vise messed up. It's not really set up for it, and I would kind of need a little bit of an angle so all the water will drip off. This way it's just going to fall straight down. So for this knife, since it's a hybrid knife handle, we're going to switch to a different method. Okay, so this is the method that I use when I'm wet sanding. This is just a piece of Delron. You could use a piece of wood, a piece of Teflon, even a piece of aluminum if you had it, whatever you have. And basically the way that I do this, and at this point you typically have a finished blade, so I get a piece of leather that's relatively soft on the inside, and I use that and I just clamp right down to that. That way my handle's here, it's over my bucket of water, I can sit here, sand it, basically work one side, then I flip it, work the other side. And that's what I'm going to do now. Okay, so what I generally do on these, this one is going to be a pretty much rustic finish knife, handle and the blade both. So I will only sand this up to probably 600 grit. So what I do is I start usually with 220. I have the wet dry sandpaper, and this is the Norton Black Ice brand. That's what I pretty much use for everything, for my blades and for my handles. It's a good waterproof sandpaper, and I like it. So basically what I do is I work my way up from 220 up to 600, and then I'll flip the knife. Sometimes I'll do the entire side if I'm only going to a low grit. Sometimes I'll do 220, flip it 220, then do 400, then flip it 400, 600, flip it 600. I'll do each side together. So when I get to it, this is going to be a lot of fast motion action. Whew! Man, I wish I could hand sand that fast in real life. Alright, so that's our knife, up to 600. I'm going to go ahead and scrub this off in some water to get any residual dust or anything off of it, and then maybe run it on the buffer wheel real quick, and then we'll be ready to put an edge on it. Alright guys, here's a quick overview of the knife after the hand sanding. So like I said, I did 220, 400, and then 600 grit. If I can keep it in focus there. Some really nice clear colored areas here in the handle. Looks really cool. So now I'm going to take it to the buffing wheel and give it just a little bit of a buff. Alright, so we're at the buffing wheel, and as I'm sure you've probably heard many knife makers say, this is the most dangerous tool that they have in their shop. The reason for that is because when you're polishing, this buffer is moving at such a high speed, and this is a low RPM buffer. It doesn't have a lot of torque, but it still has enough that it could hurt you. But while you're buffing, if this buffer catches an edge, it can flip this knife right out of your hand super quick, and it can send it launching in just about any direction. So that's why everyone says this is the most dangerous tool in their shop. So you always want to be careful. Start slowly, take your time, don't rush into using this. Some makers don't even use this. So what I'm going to be using on here is just white polishing compound. This is from Harbor Freight. I'm sure if you don't have a Harbor Freight in your area, you could probably find something similar. It's just a cheap white buffing compound. Also on your buffing wheel, I have, there's a wheel on both sides. You don't ever want to mix the wheel that you use to polish metal with the wheel that you want to polish your handles with, because there will get black metal residue on the wheel that you use to polish the blades. So if you go to polish your handle on that same wheel, it's going to turn your handle dark. If your handle's dark already, I guess it doesn't really matter, but if you have any kind of lighter woods that you're polishing or trying to buff out, it's going to turn them dark. Alright, let's go. Alright. Okay, I think we're done with that. Whenever you do buff something, you're always going to have some buffing compound residue on there. As you can see, this line going through here, that's buffing compound. So a good thing to use to clean that off is WD-40. It cleans it off really nicely, and it also gives you some oil, some moisture into your blade. Alright. Okay, so there's our handle. See some really nice colors in the blue. Man, that looks awesome. Looks like an iceberg or something. The foil showing through. It's some beautiful epoxy. These handle scales I got from Casting Kings, which he's on Instagram. I'm sure if you guys know me, you probably know him. But that's it. Last thing to do is to sharpen this. Alright guys, we're back at the 2x72. This method that I'm going to use to sharpen this is Jay Nielsen's method. Basically what you want to do is, if you have this type of a setup, I remove my flat piton, so you basically want to have a slack belt is what's going to be set up here. Now when I do this, it's very quick. I used to spend a lot of time trying to use stones and a bunch of other stuff, and I literally can get a paper cutting edge or a hair cutting edge now in a matter of minutes doing this method. Jay Nielsen has a video. I mean, it's pretty short on YouTube, and then also on his DVDs that you can buy, he has more in depth. But I'm basically going to use his method. I'm going to try and do this in real time because I want you to see how quick. So right now there is no edge at all on my blade, just to show you. And what I do is I start with a 220 belt, and then I go to a 400 belt, and then that's it. And then I go to the strop. So here we go. Okay, I'm going to switch the camera edge real quick because I want to show you what you're looking for right here. You're basically trying to develop a burr. So right now I'm done with 220, I'm ready to switch to 400, but I want to change the camera and show you this real quick. Okay, so what you're looking for is the burr, which right there, I don't know if this will focus, there we go. So you see that burr that's sticking up across the blade, the very edge of the blade? That's the burr you're trying to develop while you're sharpening. So right now I'm done on 220, I'm going to go to 400 and finish this up. Alright, set back up. I'm going to switch from 220 to 400 and keep going. Alright, that's it. Let's move out to the strop. Alright, so once we did the 400 and the 220, then the 400, then you want to go to a strop. So basically all you do on this is you want to break off that burr that you developed. And that should be it. Now the knife is sharp. And just to give you a quick demo, I'm going to sacrifice some leg hair. So, see that? So that was 5 minutes of sanding. And it's razor sharp. Alright guys, well that wraps it up. This is the last episode of this series, and this knife is finished up. So I think it turned out pretty nice. It's definitely unique. It's a nice little knife to have, like a bushcraft style knife. One of a kind. And this is my first knife hand forged in quite a while. I think since I very first started blacksmithing. But I plan to do more hand-forged knives. There's probably going to be like a flurry of them coming out here soon. I'm going to be doing a bunch of different stuff just to get back into the blacksmithing aspect of knife making as well as other stuff. So I just want to say I thank you, and I really appreciate you watching this and sticking with me through all of this. This was a cool build. This was a nice series. Also a good introduction for me into YouTube, since this series was pretty much my kind of first set of series on YouTube. I did a couple videos before it. So this knife is going to be available on my website, and for those of you that stuck to the end, if you're interested in buying this knife, if you go on my website, I will put a coupon code on there. DHV YouTube. That'll be the coupon code. I'll put it on the screen here. And if you enter that code in, I'll give you 10% off of this knife as a thank you for watching. And this is the only place I'm going to say that. I'm not going to put that on Instagram. I'm not going to put it anywhere else. So only the people that watch this video on YouTube will have that discount code. But I look forward to more videos in the future, and I want to thank you guys for watching and tuning in. If you could give me a like and a subscribe if you haven't subscribed already, I would really appreciate that. I'm trying to build up my channel, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye.